Hi people, I'm Dr. Kit, the Bee Babette. A few days ago, I had the amazing opportunity of sharing my research on bee hotels to boost bees after bushfires at the Charming Squire, a pub in Brisbane, for Pint of Science. For those who missed out, you're in luck. I'm recording this presentation again for you all to listen to it. And please subscribe to my YouTube channel, The Bee Babette, for future updates. Also, a quick note before we begin, if you hear crunching in the background, that's not me having some little snackies while I'm recording. That's my dog. She just decided that she wanted to eat while I was recording. Anyway, welcome to Bee Hotels to Boost Bees After Bushfires for Pint of Science. I'll also just give you a little information about this funky, boozy bee here. I designed this bee for Pint of Science, and I ended up spending about 7 hours designing it. The first rendition was not as good. I fortunately had someone very special, Maddie B, to help me design this. The hilarious thing is that after I spent a whole day creating it, the next day, he was quite drunk, and I did a really quick little sketch that took me 2 seconds, and he told me that design was better. Anyway, here is my Pint of Science presentation. So Pint of Science is this really cool festival held all around the world and also all across Australia, celebrating science in a really fun setting in pubs. Now, I got to present my research, Bee Hotels to Boost Bees After Bushfires, at the Charming Squire, as I mentioned, a really funky little pub in Brisbane. So that's a little bit about me there. If you want to follow my research, it's also on Twitter, Bee Babette. And my research in particular that I'm going to be talking about today is my work on bee hotels and how these might be able to help our native bees recover after bushfires. So my research for my PhD was not on bushfires, but it did involve bee hotels. Sadly, I didn't get to publish most of that research because my thesis was so big, 8 chapters long, that the research on bee hotels didn't quite make the cut. I still was working on it when the 4 years were up. But my thesis was titled Urban Native Bee Assemblages and the Impact of the Introduced European Honeybee on Plant Pollinator Networks in the Southwest Australian Biodiversity Hotspot. So there's me in my poofy hat and my fancy Harry Potter robes with this big framed certificate that says that I am now a doctor. Since then, my research has moved on to other things, mainly biodiversity surveys, but I'm also a performer and a model, and I've had these amazing opportunities to bring bees to audiences who don't usually think about our native bees. This includes drinkers of all kinds of booze and beers, because I was selected as a legit local for Liquor Barons. I also had the amazing opportunity of bringing wild bees to Fringe World, where I got to dress up as a native bee and have a photographic display and walk kids around the pleasure garden telling them about our amazing wild native bees. But on to my current research, bee hotels to boost bees after bushfires. Now, when you think of bees, you probably think of yellow and black striped bees that make honey and live in colonies. Bees are an introduced species, the European honeybee. Today I'm going to be talking about our cavity nesting bees. So about 30% of native bees nest in tiny little holes in trees created by wood-boring beetles. Now, these little holes in wood can be in short supply when these nesting resources are destroyed. This is including destroyed for urbanisation, which is what I was researching for my PhD, but they might also be destroyed by bushfires. So based on my successful research, which I still need to publish, on the ability of bee hotels to boost bees in the burbs, I hypothesized that bee hotels might also be able to provide nesting habitat to our cavity nesting native bees, mainly the mega chili, after bushfires. So bee hotels are artificial nesting structures that we can install for cavity nesting native bees. I have a book all about them, so please get in touch if you want a book on how to make them, or subscribe to my YouTube channel where I've got some instructional videos. Now, they can be used very successfully in urban areas, but be aware the commercial ones, such as those sold by Bunnings, the Mr. Fothergill's brand, are shit. They are not designed very well. Refer to my book on why they aren't. I got in a bit of strife with Bunnings because they didn't like me telling them that their bee hotels were not designed clearly by scientists and were more likely to entice spiders to live in them, which is fine. Spiders are great, but we want our native bees to be supported by these bee hotels. Now, as I mentioned, I found that installing well-designed bee hotels in urban areas can provide nesting habitat for our cavity nesting native bees. But can they be used to help bees recolonize areas after fires? This has never been tested before. Now, Australia has very diverse landscapes. Some of them are very prone and are adapted to fires. However, others, in particular tropical landscapes or landscapes that have vegetation that takes a long time to reach maturity before it even flowers, these are not adapted to fires. Now, even landscapes that are adapted to fires, with climate change and anthropogenic disturbances, there's an increase in the frequency and intensity of fires that are outside of the sort of evolutionary history that species have co-evolved with particular fire regimes. Now, I've been conducting a lit review, so a big review of the literature of all the studies that have been published on bee responses to fire. There's been very few in Australia, which I still need to publish. I need to get some funding to publish it. But the overall findings are that some bees can do quite well in response to fires, especially those that benefit from open landscapes and the massive flowers that occurs after fires in landscapes that are dominated by very heavy canopies such as pine forest. So this is all sort of northern hemisphere. However, there are some native bees that are very vulnerable to fires, and one species that has been studied in Australia, Xylocopa lestis on Kangaroo Island, it is almost extinct because of fires. Now, apart from these intense surveys with Xylocopa aurata, we don't really know how our Australian bees are faring after fires. Now, a bit about the backstory into my fire research. So the first sort of big fires that occurred in the last few years, before those big fires in the mainland, there were bushfires that ravaged Tasmania. Now, this is where I was born, and Tasmania is not a very fire-prone part of Australia. And so I was very concerned about the effect this had on wildlife, in particular native bees. And so I emailed so many people internationally, also around Australia, saying I would love to look at how the fires have impacted our bees and how we might be able to help the bees, how we might be able to better manage fires so that we can protect the native bees. Many people found that this would be a really interesting topic, and there's actually not been much research done on Australian native bees in Tasmania either. But there was no funding to support this. However, I still managed to get to Tasmania, but the funding that I got was for another project, which is a very exciting project, and I published the research from this project as part of a global project looking at pollinators, in particular bee assemblages to apple orchards all across the world, and how climate and management, such as integrated pest management, organic or conventional, influence the bee assemblages. So if you want to check out that paper, that's the title there. Send me an email and I can send you a free PDF. Now, the next year, fires ravaged Australia again, all across the mainland. And some of these fires were particularly severe. The country went up in flames, and I got very concerned about our native bees. There was a lot of media attention about the fires, media attention looking at the impact it had on wildlife, but almost all the attention was on the charismatic megafauna, the koalas, the dunnuts, the kangaroos, definitely lots of koala stories. And the fires were definitely very bad for these poor Australian native animals. But how about the bees? So I wasn't the only one thinking about bees. Some of my amazing colleagues, such as James Dorey, Ben Parslow, Katja Hodgendorn, Remco Leaves, they were also thinking about the bees. And this amazing group of scientists, bee scientists, wasp scientists, some vegetation scientists, we got together and we produced this massive multi-author paper where we modelled how the fires might have impacted the bees. We got the bee distribution records, we trawled through all the literature, looking at when bees have recorded, what plant species they've been foraging on, and then modelled this in relation to the fires, looked at their nesting habitats and how this might affect their vulnerability. So this was a really cool paper, and it was, again, published, and if you want to read that, send me an email. Now, we predict that the ground nesting bees might be less vulnerable than cavity nesting bees because ground nesting bees, research has found that ground nesting bees, if their nests are deeper than about 13 centimetres, they're relatively insulated by fires, so the offspring are okay, at least from the immediate effects of fire. Cavity nesting bees, though, they might not be so okay, and then after the fire opens up a lot of bare ground, so it might be quite good for the ground nesting bees, but for the cavity nesting bees, intense fires, destroys the trees, so that's really not good for them. But it's not really been studied, and we did this modelling study, but we need empirical data. So the federal government, they released some grants, bushfire recovery grants. This wasn't for bees, this was for plants and any animals, and you had to write this big project proposal and it got assessed. And now there were 3 rounds. The first round, I put so much effort into it. I got all these amazing scientists on board, and we were going to do some intense surveys across the country to look at the plant pollinated networks, how the native bees had been affected in controlling impact sites, what flower resources were important after fires, and bee hotels were a component of this. However, it wasn't successful. The next grant, the focus was a bit different in terms of the guidelines that we had to adhere to, and I wrote up another grant proposal looking at pollinators in threatened ecological communities that have been affected by fires. This includes in WA, where I currently was, the Stirling Ranges, but again, that wasn't successful. So they had a final round, and the guidelines for this was it had to be community-based. So I put together another proposal. I thought it wasn't as good as the other 2, but I was like, I'll give it one last shot. I also needed to be able to have a non-government organisation sort of be part of this proposal and submit it through them. So I pitched it to the Australian Native Bee Association, and I'm so grateful that, in particular, Tim Hurd, he told me that this sounded like a good idea. I should write it up, and they would be happy to be on board and submit the proposal with me. So we submitted it, and it was successful finally. Now, this one was very citizen science focused, but I also included a more intensive on-the-ground survey component by myself in WA. So we then launched a big social media campaign, and Rachel Wilson also helped me in this. I created a special Facebook group for participants. I created an iNaturalist group for the participants in the Citizen Science project to upload their bee hotel observations. Me and Rachel did bee hotel workshops. I created some videos, which you can see on my YouTube channel, the Bee Babette, information sheets, all about how we can make effective hotels. Now, this project involved people installing bee hotels in areas that have been affected by fire, and then just once a month taking a photo of the bee hotel and uploading it to an iNaturalist project. So there was that citizen science component, and then I was also doing the citizen science component in the iNaturalist, but I did some really intensive on-the-ground surveys. I installed 100 bee hotels at 5 sites and visited them monthly, taking all the photos, also recording what plants the bees were foraging on, the abundance of honeybees in relation to native bees, and recording the particular taxa that have been inhabiting the bee hotels. And I was looking at all the iNaturalist photos and then recording the taxa based on the caps that were made on the bee hotels. So if you'd like to learn yourself how you can recognize what types of bees are using your bee hotels, this can be found in my book, Creating a Haven for Native Bees, which you can email me about. So what were the results? Well, the citizen science results were not so encouraging. After our social media campaign, we had 63 people, and probably more actually, because some of those people that said that they were interested in getting on board were actually like members or leaders of big land care groups. So it seemed like we'd have heaps of participants, but we ended up only having 19. In total, 66 bee hotels were installed, and most of these were in New South Wales, and 195 bee hotel observations were made, but only 10 of these bee hotels were occupied by bees. The rest were empty or had other invertebrates, in particular spiders. So not so. But my bee hotels that I installed, it was a massive success. 900 nests were occupied. At one of the sites, 283 nests were occupied. There was quite a bit of variation between the sites, and there was slow uptake at first. So my first surveys, I was like, oh no, after all this work, making all these bee hotels and installing them and driving, about 2 hours one way to just one site. I was a bit disappointed, but, a failure of the bee hotels to be used is also learning. It's showing that the cavity nesting native bees might be really badly affected by the fires, and maybe that is the case in New South Wales, where the fires were more intense, rather than in WA, where they were less intense. But the bee hotels were definitely very successful at my sites. Now, based on my published research on Rose and Apis ignita, that's some research that I published during my PhD on this very funky bee that collects banksia fuzz and puts in its nest. I did a heap of research on this bee, and on average, there are about 3 cells per nest. So if you extrapolate, that means that these bee hotels that I installed in WA in fire-affected sites, they allow the establishment and re-colonisation of 1,200 native bees. Most of the bees using the bee hotels were the megachili. These are the ones that have the resin caps. Exonura, these ones don't put caps on, but they block the nest with their little butt, as you can see. And Hylaeus. Now, these bees, they seal their nest with this cellophane-like secretion. It's this beautiful silvery substance, and scientists are actually looking into synthesizing this material as a biologically friendly alternative to plastic. So cool. In addition to the bees, I also found other insects inhabiting my bee hotels: spiders, ants, even this very gnarly raspberry cricket, eumeniid wasps, and also parasitoid gasteruptid wasps. Here's a little video. You can see the gastrorupted wasp checking out my bee hotel. That big thing sticking out of its butt, that's not a sting, that's an ovipositor, and it uses it to insert into the nest and lay eggs. The baby wasps hatch out, eat the nectar and pollen provisions that the bee put in, as well as the baby bee. So not a great, nice behaviour on the point of the native bees. But the good thing is that if you got gastrorupted wasps, it means you've got healthy bee populations. Now, as you can see, I had bamboo bee hotels and I had wooden bee hotels, so the wooden blocks with holes drilled in them, and then bamboo stems. You can learn more about them in my YouTube videos as well as in my book. Both of them had quite a slow uptake in the initial few months, but by the last month, there was massive uptake at almost all my sites, and you can see that at 3 of my sites for the bamboo and 4 of my sites for the wooden bee hotels, 100% of the hotels were occupied. In terms of the number of nests, again, lots and lots occupied by the end. Slow at the start, then a massive increase. You can also see the variation between sites. So I had the sites where I put bee hotels up, and then I had sites where I didn't. And I was recording the number of native bees that I saw just foraging on flowers at the sites. My control sites, again, no bee hotels. Treatment sites, bee hotels. And the number of bees that I saw were significantly greater at the treatment sites, and this indicates that the bee hotels were allowing re-colonisation of these burnt habitats, whereas the burnt habitats that didn't have the bee hotels, not as many bees. So further confirmation that the bee hotels were being really useful in allowing re-colonisation of fires. In addition to recording how many native bees there were, I also recorded how many honeybees there were at the sites. And this is because honeybees could harm our native bees. Honeybees are an introduced species, and when we think of cats, cane toads, foxes, they tend to have negative impacts on our native wildlife. And I've done a lot of research on this previously. It was part of my PhD research. And I did find that some native bees were vulnerable to the effects of honeybee competition. And honeybees can harm our native bees through competing with them for nectar and pollen. So all bees need nectar and pollen. Some bees are quite generous, they forage on lots of different things like honeybees. Others are quite specialist and they'll only forage on a very narrow range of flowers. And those bees that forage on a narrow range of flowers, and these flowers, if they're ones that honeybees also like, the honeybees can have a negative impact on the native bees. So all this research is published and you can read it. Now, I did find that honeybees had a negative impact on native bees in these post-fire sites. And this does make sense because not only have I already demonstrated that honeybees can harm our native bees, but the instances when this occurs is when there's a shortage of floral resources. In urban areas, this is not so much a shortage of flowers overall, but a shortage of native flowers. So we've got lots of flowers in urban areas, but lots of these are exotics. So these give honeybees a competitive edge. But in areas affected by fires, often there's a lower diversity of flowers in the immediate post-fire habitats. Often weedy species benefit, and those amazing keystone plant species like our Mary, Coimbia, and eucalyptus that take decades to flower. I've got research that I need some funding for to publish on how important these flowering resources are. These take a long time to recover after fires, if the fires are severe. And so during these crunch times, there's less resources, and so this is when competition can be predicted to be severe. And I found significant negative associations between honeybees and the occupancy of bee hotels, as well as a significant but weak negative association between the number of native bees that I saw and how many honeybees I saw at a site foraging. And so this graph you can see when there's more nests occupied, there's fewer honeybees. honeybees that were observed. And then as you see more honeybees foraging at the site, there's fewer bee hotel nests that are occupied. So what next? Well, this is really cool research, and this can help us make sure that native bees have a chance to recolonize burnt sites. And this is important not only for the native bees, but also for vegetation communities, because native bees, they visit the flowers, and in doing so, they can act as pollinators. And we need pollinators because even if we put plants in to restore sites after fires, if there's no pollinators, then the plants won't set fruit and seeds, and therefore there won't be future generations of plants at these sites. So I really need some funding to publish these results, both the on-the-ground surveys as well as the citizen science results, which can help us guide better citizen science projects, and also publish the lit review of the impact on fire and bees. I also have a global database on bee hotel use that I'd love to publish. There's also my PhD research, where I did a lot of research, again, installing hundreds of bee hotels, looking at what the best hole size was, the utility of bee hotels in residential gardens versus bushland remnants. I also looked at the development of native bees, the interactions between gas-erupted wasps, and the impact of honeybees on native bee fitness, and even did some really funky pollen analysis where I used scanning electron microscopes to look at the pollen in the bee nests and look at how that overlapped with pollen used by honeybees, and then how this impacted on the success of the bees in terms of how many emerged and their sex ratio and their body size. So heap of data. I really would love to publish this, so please send me an email if you have some funding available. Now, you can also support our native bees by showing your native bee love. As I mentioned, there's this funky Save the Beers, Save the Bees design that I created, which is available on my Redbubble store. I also have a TeePublic store where I've created not only the Save the Bees, Save the Beers mural, but a whole heap of other fun bee designs that you can get on t-shirts, on mugs. They've just released pet bandanas, which is really cool. You can have them on caps, you can have them on face masks, which are still quite popular. If you're flying, we can finally fly interstate. So yeah, that's available there with that link. I also have a Bee Babette YouTube channel where I've got summaries of my research, videos on how to make bee hotels, and I'm going to upload more and more videos, and so you can get the latest buzz on native bees. There's also some videos of bees having sex. If you're into that kind of thing, I study the mating habits of this really cool bee called Amygilla dorsoni. So if you'd like to learn more, there's all my social media. My email, kitprendergast21@gmail.com, is where you need to go to contact me about biodiversity surveys, about performance opportunities, presentations, if you want a PDF of any of my research. I do native bee surveys, environmental impact assessments. I can help you design bee-friendly gardens. I've got a range of books, merchandise. I do school visits, and I've got some fun sort of dance acrobatic performances as well. And I'm also planning on starting a podcast, so stay tuned for that. So I have a couple of thank yous to say. Firstly, thank you to Pint of Science organisers. It's great to be able to celebrate science across the country. Well done to all the other scientists who presented their research in pubs. I'd like to thank the Australian Native Bee Association for supporting me in this research, and Rachel Wilson. And finally, and most importantly, I'd like to thank Maddie B, who encouraged me to put my hand up for Pint of Science, who came halfway across the country with me to be at Pint of Science, and even wore this really funky native bee shirt. It meant so much to me. I really appreciate it. So, Maddie B, you're the best.